Hi guys, this is SDJRSNF88 speaking, with a look at a new project, the construction of a World War I armoured train. So I thought this project would be a great follow-on from the World War I trench railway, and hopefully provide a centrepiece for a future layout. The project will combine a number of different techniques to build the armoured train, first of which will be a bit of a ready-to-run adaptation, so adapting a few ready-to-run models. There will also be a fair bit of kit bashing, along with the construction of this kit here, which will provide the base for the entire armoured train. Now this is a Military Techniques kit depicting a World War II armoured train, which bears a number of striking resemblances to a number of World War I armoured trains, and this is what I plan to adapt and modify slightly to create the feel of a World War I armoured train. So inside we have many components to build up this armoured train. The first of which you can see here is the first of four armoured cars which are provided with the kit, and then just to the right you can see the main body for the locomotive. Now the locomotive itself, for my armoured train, I plan to do a bit of a RTR adaptation and modify a ready-to-run locomotive into an armoured train, possibly using some of the components here. But it will look a lot different to this locomotive provided in this kit. So there'll be a few little bits and pieces used from this, but it will be mostly built from scratch. So if I just remove all these components here, as you can see there's quite a few in there. There's also a bit of track provided, but that will be of not of any use to this project. If we go to the instruction manual, you can see there's a very informative manual for the construction of the cars and the locomotives. And then at the back we have the assembly of what hopefully the armoured train will look like when it's complete. So as you can see we've got two artillery cars on the front and two on the back with the locomotive in the centre. Now as mentioned, it'll be my locomotive in the centre here, and like I said as well, I plan to adapt a couple of these cars as well, possibly combining two of these together to provide a long bogie armoured car, very similar to Zaamurets, which was one of the more formidable armoured trains deployed during the First World War, and has sort of been immortalised in Battlefield 1 for those of you who like to play a bit of online gaming. Right, so I've just set up my little portable workbench, and it's time to get started on the first of the armoured cars. So here is the first of the armoured cars. What I've done so far is built the top half of the body, as the bottom half will need to be modified to include a ready-to-run chassis. But I've made a few modifications to the actual design of the kit. First of all, a number of the etched parts that come with the model for steps and stuff, they're very fragile, very fiddly, and a number of them snapped during the process, so I've decided not to add them. But a number of etched parts have been added. You can see the door panel there, and the shields for the cannon there. Another modification is this little observation sort of parapet on top of the turret there. This is a feature that was seen on a number of World War I armoured trains, and this little bit here is basically a spare part that comes with the kit, and there's one for each car. So the great thing is I'm going to use these on top of the turrets to make them look more like their World War I counterparts. So with the first and second car complete, I thought I would try something a bit different with the third and fourth. So I've come up with the idea of gluing them together to make one large artillery car. Basically a bit like the wagon that, the main artillery piece that formed the main part of Zaamurets, the World War I armoured train. So what I'm going to do is cut off the diagonal end pieces here and glue these two together, and then they'll both have two turrets. So we'll have one at the front, one at the rear. Then there'll be a few little extra details that I plan to add in the middle. So I plan to add a couple of opening hatches, possibly a searchlight or some other little bit of detail in the middle there. Pretty much the same design as what Zaamurets was. So without further ado, I'm going to crack out the hacksaw and just carefully trim these two little bits here and hopefully put these two pieces together. So the next step of the build is to start positioning the armoured car bodies on some form of running chassis. Now for this I've gone for two slightly different methods. The first, for the main armoured bogie car, is this. Now this is a chassis from a Dapple Stanier 57-foot non-corridor kit, and the idea is to position the body on top of this chassis and then the lower parts of the frame underneath, and basically have it as one sort of main body around this chassis. The bogies and everything you really need for this kit is all in this bag. So you've got couplings, wheels, some weights, and the bogies themselves. Everything is in there. So all I just have to do is assemble the bogies, put them on the bottom, and then build the skirts around it. The only issue is I've got to make sure there's enough movement or enough swing to go around the radius 2 curves that this train will have to go around, and make sure that the bogies don't foul the skirts that I'm going to be adding. Apart from that, it should be quite a simple build, because what I've noticed is if you look, you can just see that the main body is just the right length for the chassis. So I'm going to be able to use the original buffers off of the chassis as the buffers for the armoured car, which is brilliant. Now for the smaller armoured cars, I'm going to go for something slightly different. Now this is a Dapple 21-ton hopper chassis. Now you can purchase these just as chassis as they are. My idea is I'm going to cut a rectangle in the bottom of this skirting plate and position this inside. Now as you can see, if I position the chassis underneath the skirt, you can see the wheelbase is a tad shorter than the original planned wheelbase on here. But hopefully this will allow the wagon to go around slightly tighter corners with its fixed wheelbase. But we'll have to see. Now this is going to require a lot more building than the bogie car in theory, because I've got to add buffers on, add mounts for the couplings, ECT. Another thing I've noticed, especially with this chassis, I'm putting it on a flat surface, is that this particular chassis has appeared to have warped when it's been made, and as you can see, it doesn't sit flat. Which means I'm not sure if I'm going to use this one or not. Another option possibly is to cut the holes out where the original wheels would go. Obviously I need to make them a bit more narrower because this was 1.72 scale, so the wheels are slightly wider on the kit. Basically put a little metal tube in there and then run the wheel through the metal tube, and then hopefully that will run smoothly that way. But we'll get to that hurdle when we get to it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start cutting these little lugs off here, which would allow the body to clip it on for the Stanier coach kit, and then start resting this on and measuring it up and finding out where I need to trim the skirt and everything to get this body locked onto here. Right, so as you can see, the armoured car is now mounted on the chassis. Now this was a bit difficult than I originally anticipated. As mentioned, I originally planned to just cut a hole in these base pieces and just have the bogie sort of hanging through. But I found quite quickly that there wouldn't be enough space inside to allow the bogies to rotate. So what I did instead was I cut the skirts completely off the base pieces, and I glued them to the sides of the actual body. And instead of giving them a tapered edge like they do on the original frames, I gave them a perfectly flush straight edge, and there is now plenty of room inside for the bogies to pivot around. And I tested the model on the track, and it even goes around second radius curves, which is absolutely perfect. So while I was at it, I also added a few more details. So you can see I've added these etch parts here. So we've got the little protectors by the buffer beams there. We also have the oiling points for the bogies, which are now attached to the sides. And in the middle here, I'm very, very pleased with this. There was quite a substantial join between the two base pieces, because they are obviously been extended out at the ends to create this sort of lip on the buffer beam here. It meant there was about a centimetre gap between the two skirts. So what I ended up doing was I ended up putting a bit of a cardboard in there and filling in the gap and smoothing it down, much with like some of the other cracks you can see I've also filled in on the model. But then I went through some of the etched parts in the kit, and one of the things I don't intend to use is the tender for the locomotive, which is a World War II tender. So I started stripping some of the etched parts from that, and I found this beautiful sort of riveted plate which makes up part of the rear of the tender. And there's another one on the other side, and what I did is I cut these panels out of that tender piece, and as you can see they fit in there just perfect. So I've glued one on each side, and it really does add to the effect of the model. Another thing I've also done, you can probably just about see it from the front, if I turn the model around very delicately now, you can see I've also added this. Now this is a Class 47 Batman snowplow from one of their sort of extra packs you could buy separately fitted like snowplows to add to your models. And I noticed quite a lot of armoured trains were fitted with these sort of snowplows, basically to shift any debris that had been laid on the track to try and derail them. And with a bit of cutting and reshaping, I've managed to reshape these quite modern snowplows into a very good representation of some of the snowplows I found, or not really snowplows, or these plows that I found on these armoured trains. So I'm very, very pleased with how that has turned out. So now it's all glued in place and it's just drying. The next step is to give the model another layer of primer to cover up all the etched bits, and then I guess the final thing for this car is of course to start applying the livery. So I've recently had a little rethink on how I'm going to do the two cars that form the rear of the armoured train. Now, as I mentioned recently, I was going to use this chassis here, which is a Dapol 21-ton hopper chassis, and basically put it inside the skirt. But as you can see, the design is actually a lot shorter than what is actually on the skirt itself. But also as well, as I previously touched upon, the wagons don't ride level. So I went back to the drawing board and I came across these. Now this is a Dapol Fruit D wagon, which is part of their unpainted range, so you can buy these to paint in your own livery of choice. And I thought what a great model this would be. Actually owning some of these as part of my main model railway fleet, I know how heavy these things are, and realised how sort of rigid the chassis is. This would form a great chassis for the armoured train. And anyway, I had a little look, and as you can see, the length of this compared to the skirt is actually almost spot on. So what I've gone and done is I've taken one apart. The body itself won't go to waste. The body will be used as a grounded body on my layout or on another future project, so sort of a bit of recycling in a way. And what I've gone and done is I've mounted, or temporarily mounted, one of the bodies to the chassis. And if you can see, if I just remove the body itself and the weight, I'll glue that down at a later stage. But you can see I've trimmed this sort of lip that holds the original body, the box body, in place. And this allows the gun armoured body to sit perfectly flush on the frames, which is perfect. And the funny thing was, originally I was going to intend to put the skirt on this as well, but I went back and started looking at more designs of armoured train during the First World War, including the one in particular that I'm basing this on. And studying these two rear cars in a bit more detail, found that the majority of them didn't actually have skirts on at all. they tended to have like sort of armour-plated boxes over the axle boxes themselves, but nothing else really in between. In fact, many of the armoured cars themselves, pretty much like the locomotives, were sort of rushed, armour-plated normal wagons. So really this could have started off life as a box car or something, and then it actually had the armour-plated body attached on top. So pretty much like what I'm doing here in model form. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to disassemble this one here and basically do the same thing as what I've done with this one, trim the little lip off around, and then hopefully mount this body as well. Then it'll be on to spray painting them and attaching these bodies permanently, and then figuring out some sort of way to add a few little details for the armour plated axle boxes. So without further ado, let's get started. Of course, no armoured train would be complete without an armoured locomotive. So for this, I've gone for a Pico or Pico G7080 locomotive. Now, there's a number of reasons why I've chosen this particular model. First of all, it looks very similar to the locomotives that were used with these sort of armoured trains, especially Zaamurets. Zaamurets was a armoured train powered by a 080 locomotive, very similar to this design. Of course, the locomotive and tender was armour plated, but there were similar armoured trains that did use locomotives that were not armour plated, and in fact looked very similar to this design. Now, the second reason is the design of this model. It really is perfect for this sort of kit bash. Now, as I will show you this little model's little party trick here, if you lift off the dome, it reveals a little screw down in this hole here. And if you unscrew the screw like what I've already done, the whole body comes off of the locomotive, revealing no motor. That's because the motor is in the tender here. Now, this tender is die cast, it is really, really heavy, and there's a lovely powerful motor with, I believe, 2 brass flywheels on it, which is perfect for this build, which provides slow and smooth and, of course, powerful running. It's also got directional lighting. There's also some lights on the rear and on the front. Now, this design, of course, is perfect for this build because, as you can see here, I've got the armour-plated body from the kit, and with a little bit of modification on the rear, you will see it slots perfectly over the chassis. Sorry, it's just cut off a bit at the front of the shot there. There we go. And you can see we've got in the build of, or the overall look of an armour-plated locomotive. Now, as mentioned, this whole armoured train build is based on Zaamurets, and this design looks very, very similar to how she would have looked. The tender of the locomotive used was very, very basic, a bit of armour plating here and there, but not much different to a standard tender. The locomotive, however, had skirts and armour plating around the cab and over the boiler, which is basically similar to the design that comes with the kit. So my idea being, just simply remove this body, put this one on, and away we go. So without further ado, we're going to basically start detailing this body, drill a little hole in the top so we can use the same screw from the original locomotive to hold the body on, and hopefully by the end of this we will have a fully armour-plated locomotive to go with our train. So while the body's off drying, I've decided to get round to fitting the sound decoder and speaker to the running chassis. Now I've gone for an ESU lock sound programmed with an 8F sound recording from Southwest Digital, as I wanted this armoured train to have a bit of oomph, and I know that the 8F recording from Southwest Digital has that, and hopefully will add a lot of effect to this armoured train. So as you can see, it fits in there quite snug. The decoder slots in just above where the light fitting is at the front of the chassis, and the speaker with the little speaker box removed fits in there nice and snug with a bit of black tack underneath where the cab will be too. So I'm just going to test fit the body once the paint is dried, of course, and then hopefully we will have a complete armoured train. So after 5 months of hard work, we now finally have the complete setup for the armoured train, with all 3 armoured cars and the locomotive finally all paired together. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is take a closer look at each of the individual items of rolling stock that make up the train, and show you the final few pieces that I've added to the models to get the formation we see here. So first up we have the armoured bogie car. Now this is probably one of the items that I'm most pleased and impressed with, as it took a lot of work to create this. As you know, combining the 2 4-wheel cars together to make this one complete unit was quite complicated and quite a challenge, but I'm really pleased with the end result. As you can see, the model looks really smart in its flat black livery, as does the rest of the train. Now I've gone for this livery purely because I thought it suited the train itself quite well. It picks out all the rivet details and has given a nice finish, but mainly because the real armoured train, which I've based this on, carried a number of different liveries, and all being black and white images, it's quite hard to pick out what livery the train actually was, but it was rumoured it carried a number of different camouflages, and possibly flat black was one of them. So I thought this livery suited it quite well, and as mentioned, it picks out all the rivet details and around the gun ports quite nicely, so it really does suit the train quite well. So other little details that sort of stand out on this car is of course the guards around the sides of the buffer beams, and the plough on the front as well, which is just out of shot. Of course there's a few little details I wish to add to this in the not too distant future. The main one is a little chain link coupling to the front buffer beam, just to give it a bit more of an extra detail. I thought it'd be a nice little touch considering there's no coupling there. Next up we of course have the armoured locomotive. Again, this is another part of the build that I was really impressed with, and one thing that I was really glad with is that I can exchange this armour plated body for the original body from the donor locomotive that is actually underneath. Getting the front coupling on there, which is a sort of a medium-sized tension lock coupling. This is to prevent locking when pushing the armoured car at the front there. Fitting that to the body was quite a challenge, as the front smoke box door armour plating is actually an etched part. So trying to attach a coupling to that was extremely difficult. In the end, I added a little bracket that runs underneath the train itself and holds the coupling on there nice and tight. And as you can see, it fits in there quite well. And because of the buffer guards on the armoured car in front, it's hardly noticeable. So that's one thing I'm really pleased about this part of the build with. Of course, other little details that I've added are the little flaps on the driver's windows. I thought that was a nice little touch. And of course the exchanged funnel. The funnel is different to one that originally came with a kit. I wanted a nice round funnel, much like the train I've based this on. So I found, I think it was a nib from a eyeliner pen that was going spare, so I managed to cut that down to size, and it really fits on there quite well. Again, a few little details I plan to add to this, the locomotive, is a nice bit of, basically a nice little brass whistle. That will be a brass pipe that runs from the cab along the top of the boiler to the dome, and it will stick up behind the dome, which is and will be like represent like a nice little hooter whistle, which is much like the design that was on the original train. And I thought that'd be a nice feature, and of course add a bit of colour to the otherwise sort of flat look of the train. Again, you can see the tender there is from the original locomotive that the body sits on, and as you can see the colours match up quite well with the overall flat black livery that I've gone for the whole armoured train. And finally we come on to the 2 rear armoured cars on the train. Again, I really love the overall look of these, and I quite like the idea of them not having the skirts on and giving them the effect that they were converted wagons, much like the train that it's been based on. You can see the little guards that I've added to the axle boxes. Once painted black, they blend in really, really well, and they make the sort of the underframe stand out with all the brake rigging and other bits and pieces underneath there as well. To the car on the far rear of the train, you can just about see the tips of the snow plough or the plough that I've added on there, much like the one on the front, and it really does, when the train's going backwards, make that car look very formidable and stand out much like the real train. Again, like the front car, I plan to add a chain link coupling as a little detail to that as well. Of course, at the moment the train is as it is, probably looks a bit too factory fresh, but I do plan to weather the train at some point. Of course, I'm going to wait a bit of a while to do that, because I've got an idea for a little project, and I would rather weather it then when that project is underway. So I'll go into a bit more detail in a second. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this project. I thought it'd be nice to basically put the whole project in one complete video rather than doing weekly and monthly updates on the build. I thought it'd be nice to show it from start to finish, and I hope you enjoyed this sort of format of project. It's taken 5 months to do so, but I'm very, very pleased with the end result. And as we just touched upon, taking a look at each individual item, the train is by no means complete. I plan to add a few more little finer details in the not too distant future, and of course potentially get round to building a special little layout for this train to run on. Once I've sort of built that layout, I'll probably weather the locomotive to blend in with the surroundings, much like what I've done with my World War I trench railway stock on Amiens 1918. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this project. It's been certainly fun to build, and I still can't believe that it's come together like this. I'm really, really pleased with the results, and I hope you are too. So let me know what you think of the project in the comments section below. But anyway, I guess a nice way to round off this video will, of course, to see this thing in action. So without further ado, we'll get some running clips on the go now. And I guess all that's left to say is this has been STJR Senef 88 speaking, and thanks for watching.